everyone, Clio here, and today I'm going to be doing a tag video. So as always with a tag video, I'll link the original creator and their video down below. I was actually also tagged for this one by Sarah from Voyage Through Words, and I'll also have her video and her channel down in the description below. But so this is a tag video all about bookish memories, and you know, the first time that you did certain things concerning reading. If you know my channel, you know I have no memory at all, so this is going to go very well. So as a result, I also take this as a little bit of a challenge that we can take, maybe a drinking game if you don't drink or you don't want to drink, or it's like, I don't know what time it is when you're watching this video. Definitely feel free to substitute with something else, like eating all the chocolates every single time that I say I don't know, or some variation of that. But so let's just dive into it, because I don't know, this is like the worst scenario you can put me through, trying to make me remember things, especially since I don't think there's anything reading wise that I consider like a milestone or something that I need to take note of. So I really don't know what these questions are gonna, what my answers are gonna be, or what I'm gonna be able to say about any of these, rather than, I don't know. First question, what is the first full-length book that you remember reading on your own? I don't know. Who knows these things? Seriously, serious question. Who actually remembers the first book that you read? The first book that I remember having read is Letter to the King by Tom Drachts. It's definitely one that I remember having read, because it's a book that got me into reading, or one of the 3 books that got me into reading, but I'm pretty sure that that's probably the first one out of those 3 that I read. But I know that I read the books, and I read Zusjes Kriegel by Magde Bell, and I assume that they were first. I assume that I read those before I read Letter to the King. But there probably are a lot of other books that I read before that I cannot remember at all at this point in time. Because I wasn't a huge fan of reading when I was young. I always thought that that's because of my competitive nature, and I'm a slow reader, and when you are learning to read, at least in Belgium, reading is often associated with the reading speed, and so like when you have to do tests to determine your reading level, it's based off of how many words you can read in a certain time. But I do definitely sometimes need time to refocus on what I'm reading, because like my mind will get scattered or things like that, so I need to make sure that I reread certain things sometimes, or that I'm absolutely focusing. And so I actually think that maybe that is like linked to ADHD or ADD or something like that, because I was super active as a child, and my mother was always saying like, yeah, you won't like going to music school, for example, because you have to sit down all the time. So maybe that is also part of the reason why up until the age of like 10, 11, I didn't like reading, because I was just too active. My parents were constantly losing me everywhere, because I'm always like get impatient and just run away. I have a scar on my lip here somewhere, because I was going down a water slide, and my mother needed to like pick me, like catch me at the end of the slide, because I couldn't swim yet, but I couldn't wait for my mother to stop talking to another parent, so I did go down the slide and bumped my lip against the bottom of the pool. So yeah, I was quite impatient, I was quite active as a child, and maybe that's part of the reason why I'm kind of a late reader. Second question, what is the first series you remember finishing? I don't know. So my intuitive answer is Harry Potter. However, that is absolutely wrong, because Harry Potter was finished when I was at university. I was like probably my first or second year of university when the final book came out. So that's definitely not the first series that I read. Or that I finished, because that's the question. So series I read in my teenage years. So I'm gonna say it's gotta be like the Abhorsen series. Dan and Shan series maybe? I don't know when that's finished. The Final Empire. No, not the Final Empire, the Empire trilogy by Jenny Woods and Raymond E. Weiss. But there are a couple of series that I read in my teenage years that could be the first one. I'm gonna say it's probably gonna be the Empire trilogy by Raymond E. Weiss and Jenny Woods. I'm gonna call that my answer here, okay? It's total conjecture, because I'm not entirely sure, but who knows. Third question, what is the first book to movie adaptation you remember watching knowing it was a book to movie adaptation? I'm gonna assume Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings came out relatively early when I was in high school, or when I was in secondary school, so I think they came out at the end of the 90s or the very latest beginning of the 2000s. So it is like early half of my high school career, meaning and I was definitely aware of them being adapted from books because my mother told me so, and after watching the first movie I then went into the books. So I'm gonna say that's the answer, and this is one that I'm pretty confident about. Fourth question, what was your first book crush? And I just like that question. I don't crush in real life. I don't crush on celebrities. I don't crush on fictional characters. So what I'm gonna say to that, I guess I'm gonna say something like Darren Shan or Alex Rider. I like those characters a lot. I rooted for those characters. Is that the same as a crush? No. I did root for certain romances, you know. So a romance that I read in my teenage years, a lot of the books don't really have, or the romance wasn't as centered to most of these in my memory. So I think there's this sort of like, there's a series that has a book called Harp Winds, or Winds of Power, Weapons of Power. I have a picture up there, I guess. That had a romance in it somewhere. The Empire trilogy has a romance in it that I was definitely rooting for. There was more rooting for the character in general than for that romance, but and then like there's an Anne West series that I think only exists in Dutch that definitely had a lot of romance at its center. So apart from that, I don't think that up until like YA became popular in the 2000s, I read a lot of books that were actually super centered on romance, or that I was reading in which I was rooting for those romances. So don't know the answer to this question. Who was your first bookish friend? I think we have to go quite far into my life before we get there, because you know, there were some people who loved reading when I was a young child, but I didn't love reading, so they're not bookish friends. And then when I was in high school and I was a big reader, I don't think, not a whole lot of my friends read, and those that did read different things than me. They didn't really like fantasy, so in that sense we also didn't really talk about books all that much. So I think we have to wait until I'm really at university for me to find a friend who was reading the same things as I was, and for me to absolutely fangirl about books together with other friends. So that's probably true. That we have to wait until I'm like 21 or something. No, not even. We have to wait until I'm like 19 probably for my first bookish friend to show up. Next question, what is the first adult book you remember reading not for school? I don't know. And that is something, and I don't know whether that is because of, whether that is just something historically or whether that is something like American, but I have read adult books since high school. I would go to the fantasy section of the library to look for fantasy reads, and a big part of those were adults, without that being a problem. I feel like nowadays there's so much emphasis on reading for your age, but I never read for my age. I, since the age of 12, 13 probably, did check out the adult section in the library without any sort of problems. I don't think I've ever read anything that made me go like, oh, this is not intended for my age, or this is too difficult for me, or anything like that. And as I said, there was no YA when I was young, and I don't know whether that is part of the problem, that, you know, with the introduction of YA, there was a little bit more of a transitional book for you to pick up between children literature and adult literature. And of course there were YA books being written at my time. They were just either in the children's section or in the adult sections. They were just not targeted as much. But there was nothing that was really targeted towards that certain age group, meaning that I often stepped outside of that age group at that point in time. So my first adult book, I would probably also once again say the Empire trilogy. It's like the one series that I know I read when I was a teenager that is absolutely, certainly adult. You know, there were a lot that would probably qualify as adult, but maybe could have been marketed as YA if they came out at a time in which YA was a thing. But with that one, I'm definitely sure it needs to be adult, because the first book has like domestic abuse in it, and it has possibly a rape scene in it as well. So yeah, that would be mature content. 7th question, who was your first character role model? I don't take characters as role models, but like fanciful Clio as a child wanted to live in a magical school the way that Harry Potter did. Like imaginative Clio wanted to be a teenage spy the way that Alex Rider was. The books that I was reading were always this sort of separate thing. They were always this sort of separate reality, and I wasn't really relating it to my own reality. So in that sense, they're never role models. But yes, fanciful me sometimes would imagine being like in one of those fantasy worlds, living that type of life. So in that sense, yes, Alex Rider I would guess then, and sort of the Harry Potter universe. 8th question, who was the first author you were truly inspired by? Oh, once again, I don't have an answer for you there. So I tend to disassociate author from work very much. Art and artists are very separate for me. I usually do zero research into an artist. I know a couple of authors, definitely. I mean, I know authors, of course, and I know a little bit more about certain authors than I do about others, for example, but I've never really associated books with their author, and as a result I've also never really been inspired by an author, because I can maybe be inspired by a work but not by an author himself. And I wanted to be an author, but mainly just because I liked reading. I was a big reader, so I wanted to be able to create these type of fictional works as well. And so in that sense we could say I was inspired by J.K. Rowling, because she had created this whole world that I loved inhabiting, that I loved imagining myself in, or that I loved following stories from. But I never really associated that with J.K. Rowling herself, for example. And to this day I don't really tend to think of the author of a book, except for the fact that that is the name linked to that book. But for a lot of them I don't know what they look like. I don't know what nationality they are, for example. I don't know what gender they have, what gender identity, whether they are LGBTQIA+. I don't do any research into my authors, because I separate the two. Maybe to an extent that isn't... Maybe I should look into authors more, but it's really not natural to me, so I tend to not do that. Tend not to put energy into that, because it's not that important for me. 9th question, what was the first book you remember touching or moving you? The biggest that I can remember is definitely Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, because that's the first time I cried, I think, in a book, is in the final part of the book where Harry Potter is in the office of Dumbledore after the whole showdown, and that scene and the anger and the emotion of Harry really triggered me to cry. That's the first time I remember crying. However, I also read some Dirk Brakke books, and I definitely read those before I read Harry Potter 5, and those are what would nowadays be considered YA contemporary, like hard-hitting YA contemporary. So I think in that case it's probably more correct to state that it is Blauw is Bitter by Dirk Brakke, which is a book about this girl who's sold into prostitution. And so that book really stuck with me, and I actually reread it a few years back, so it's probably the most accurate one. It's probably the first one. 10. What was the first classic you read not for school? So the first classic I read will be when I started studying literature. Before that I've never read a classic, pretty sure. I think in high school we might have read some modern classics, but we definitely didn't read classics. So first classics will be when I was studying literature, and in that sense the first classic I remember that I read around that time but that I didn't read for my literary studies were either a Jane Austen or Moby Dick. And Moby Dick was not a good experience, so if that's the first one, then I'm happy to say that it didn't keep me from reading classics afterwards, because it could have easily done so. 11th question was the first YA book you read? As I said, there was no YA when I grew up, so technically labeled as YA. I'm guessing we're gonna have to go with Twilight for that, which came out when I was at university. So probably when I was 20 or something, that's Twilight's, like that I read Twilight's. But in terms of books that could be labeled as YA, I'm going to say that Darren Shan is probably the one that I'm most convinced about would be YA at this point in time. Alex Rider probably as well, though I think the writing style for Alex Rider fits in more with like late teen than with YA, but not entirely sure about that. But so I'm gonna say Darren Shan. He's probably the one that fits in best with that. And then the final one, what was the first ebook you read? Do people remember these things? Who remembers the first ebook? Is this a huge accomplishment in my reading life that I've read an ebook? What did I read on my Kindle? When I got my Kindle, I definitely read. So what I've read on my Kindle, mainly I've read a lot of romance on my Kindle. A lot of romance I didn't bother physically buying, but I did get on my Kindle, so it wouldn't surprise me if that is the first one. I read a few classics on my Kindle as well because they were like for free on Kindle, and then I read the Selection series by Kira Cass on my Kindle. I've read the Study series by Maria V. Schneider on there. Possibly that's one of the first one. The Study series. I'm gonna say that that's my answer. The Study series by Maria V. Schneider. That's early days Kindle time, I think. But I'm not entirely sure about this. I could be totally wrong. But so yeah, those are my answers to my first Bookish Times book tag. I am very curious whether you know the answers to any of these for yourself. Are these things that you remember? I'm always curious because I have such a bad memory in general. The only thing that I'm good about remembering is like when it comes to work related stuff. Like we work a lot with machines and they have serial numbers, and I can remember serial numbers very well. And like when I see a serial number, I can be like, yeah, that's a Spanish one because I do the Spanish market. So I can recognize some of those serial numbers very well. But when it comes to what I've read, for example, I mean, I can remember whether I read it and possibly also whether I liked it, but specifics? No, I have a horrible memory. And so for me it's very weird to consider that people actually remember these things, because I don't understand how you can, because I'm clearly incapable of remembering these things. So let me know if you do, and then I can wonder at the way your mind works in the comments down below. But so yeah, I hope you enjoyed this one and see you guys for a future video. Bye!